You're in the studio, working on a pop track. The producer tells you it needs to go more epic in the chorus. You reach for the tape delay because you know it's only a matter of time until they ask you to play something that sounds like... Video I uploaded was about learning the basics of major triads, but they're really only the beginning. You can use those simple voicings to play any song, but if they end up sounding too basic, things get really interesting when you start to blur the edges between them. And in fact, doing this forms the basis of that whole genre of chiming textural guitar playing. And sometimes, you gotta go there. The first thing we can do with our chord shapes is to add suspensions. In a chord, the note we call the third is the note that defines it as major or minor. In this case, major. It's the note that makes it sound happy. If you replace the third with a fourth, or sometimes a second, you get a suspension. You recognize that sound already, right? It's called a suspension because in classical theory, it's normally a temporary device used to add tension. It feels up in the air. And it always resolves back to where it comes from, for a feeling of release, a feeling of coming home. But in modern music, those rules are out of the window, and we can hold these chords as long as we like, no matter how tense they sound. You can write songs around them, you can really live in that harmonic space. Every one of the major triad shapes you've learnt can be suspended in both of those ways. And I find the sound so evocative I can't help but hear riffs and melodies waiting to be written with them. So let's find some suspensions. But you might think the first question is, if I'm going to change the third of a chord, how do I know which note is the third? Well, you could work it out from the major scale that the chord is based on. But I think a better way is just to listen, experiment, and try to get a feeling for what the notes in the chords mean. So let's try that. Let's try this C major triad, right? Around the 8th fret. Which note is the third? Well, let's experiment. What about the top note? It's doing something, but it's not changing between major and minor. It's not giving me the suspension I want. The next note, I mean, that's really cool, but it's not the sound I'm going for. Okay, there's minor, there's major, suspended fourth, major, minor, which means that suspended second must be. So just grab a triad shape and move notes around until you get a sound. And you might find something else that's even more cool or even more useful to you. So if all 6 of those major triad shapes we learnt can be suspended both ways, let's find them. We're going to do this in the key of G major just because it makes it easy to see them all on the guitar neck. Let's begin here, around the 3rd fret. So in this case, the middle note is the 3rd. 1, 2, 3, right? So you've got the 3rd there. We can raise that to a sus4, like that. Bring it back to major, and then we can find a sus2 here. Now that shape might seem like a stretch, it's not as difficult as it looks, and you can do some beautiful things with it. We're going to come back to that shape later. Let's move on to the next voicing. This is the next G major. We can find a sus4 here, because the bottom note is the 3rd. Oh, hang on. Don't we know that shape already? G major, G sus4. Wasn't that the same shape as sus2 here? Well, you're going to find this a lot. You're going to see a lot of shapes repeating. And maybe you've just discovered something special about these chords. We're going to talk about that a bit more later on. So we've got G major, G sus4, G major, and then G sus2 would be there. Let's move on. The next G triad is here. At this chord shape, the top note is the 3rd. So we find sus4 like this. Once again, it's just a repeat of a... You can see it. Back to major. sus2. Major. Let's move on to the next set of strings now. So we're back to the 3rd fret, top 3 strings. Here's G major. The bottom note here is the 3rd, so we can raise that up to the 4th for a sus4. Back to major, and then the sus2 would be... Can you see that I need to revoice the chord with my left hand there, which is kind of difficult. Some of these are easier or harder to play than others, and you'll find the ones that you like the most. That's kind of what's so nice about them. They form part of your personal vocabulary. Let's find the next shape. It's here. So that's G major. G sus4 is here. Back to G major. Sus2 is played like this. That's kind of a bit awkward. But once again, you can do some chiming things with that you can't with anything else. The last G major voicing is here. Sus4. Back to major. Sus2. By now you can see so many repeated shapes in all of these. And that's kind of where the magic starts coming in. Because these are not primary colours on your paintbrush. They have these edgy kind of twilight qualities to them, because every one of these voicings actually can be thought of as way more than one chord. They can imply other chords, and they can create pedal notes and drones. Let's experiment and see what we could do on a real song. Let's take Free Fallin' by Tom Petty. It's such a classic, and it's a real 3-chord classic, but the 3 chords are really memorable, so it's a good vehicle for us to experiment with the voicings we know now. It's going to sound really empty if we only play triads, so let's have some acoustic guitar playing the basic open chords just like this. So we can begin by using this as a much more challenging exercise on how well we know our triads. Probably the most recognizable way you could play the riff is like this. And sounds nice. Let's try a different one. Remember the 6 ways. Try another one. What about? But if we come back to the melody we recognize, I can't help but thinking there's something missing. And in productions like this, you often hear in the keyboards something like this. Can you hear? It's this static voice which creates this beautiful kind of melancholy romantic sound, because it doesn't move with the chords. It kind of blurs the edges, like we were talking about earlier. It makes the chords kind of merge into one another and glue together and not sound like separate things so much. Maybe we can do that with the triads. What about this? Can you hear how the bottom 2 notes are always the same? They're not changing. The melody is the same on the top. Let's try it in a different voicing. It's different, but it's still really beautiful, right? What about really low? Yeah? That's kind of cool. Or see how creative that can suddenly be. Everyone has its own texture and its own sense of melody, but it all makes the song feel up in the air. So we've just found a beautiful way to play Free Fallin', but you might ask, what's actually happening with the chords? It seems like it must be more complicated than it sounds. Well, Doesn't have to be. You can just think about it like this. G sus4, G sus2. But remember, the chords underneath are going G, C, G, D, right? G, C, G, D. So what does that mean for those new voicings we're playing? Why don't we work it out slowly? So we've got the G, and then the next chord is this, which is G sus4. But look, there's a C note underneath. So what does that voicing mean for C? Look, C, that's a C major triad, and that would be C sus2. So we're actually going G, C sus2, and then back to G. And then what about the next one? That looks like G sus2, doesn't it? If there was a G in the bass, but there isn't. There's a D in the bass now. It's actually, if that was a D major, that's D sus4. So G sus2 is the same as D sus4. The only thing that's different is the bass note. And this is the lesson that we've got to learn from it. How powerful are bass notes? So you've been learning these beautiful melodic shapes with triads and suspensions, and you've got all of the creativity up in the sky, holding it all up in the air. But the bass player is still deciding what the chords really mean. And sometimes that means you. That can mean you are the bass player because you're playing the lowest note. For example, if you're playing on your own on acoustic guitar. And the next step of this harmony, which is super exciting, is what happens when you start to take some of these voicings and change the bass notes. There's all sorts of much more evocative voicings we can start to explore, and there's going to be another video on that. So if you're interested, make sure you hit subscribe. Thanks for watching. See you next time.